Good morning. The following session, Fostering the Imagination of a Child, will be presented by Reverend Aaron Schultz, who serves as Associate Pastor, Headmaster, and Teacher at Advent Lutheran Church and School in Zionsville, Indiana. Please welcome Reverend Schultz.
To all of you. Sorry. There have been a few similar talks to the imagination and great imaginative literature over the past couple days, so I really thought I might get 5 people in here, which is, it's good. Great turnout. Thanks for being here. I really do appreciate it. I think maybe a good place to start is for you to kind of understand where I'm coming from, and that's going to just make this presentation have a bit more sense to it. So, the first 10 years of my professional life was in Lutheran education. The first 5 were at a run-of-the-mill, traditional Lutheran school. And then the second 5, well, let's see, that would have been 2011, 2012, a woman came into my life that changed the course of my life. And that was Mrs. Julia Habrecht, not my wife. I spent 5 years in traditional education, and then I got a teaching job at her school at Emmanuel Lutheran in Alexandria. And I knew nothing about classical education until I got there. And it changed the trajectory of my life. Immediately, I realized that this is the way education is to be done. So I spent 5 years there under the leadership and guidance of the very well-equipped Mrs. Habrecht, and then went to seminary at Fort Wayne in 2018. And 4 years of seminary, and then I was placed at Advent Lutheran in Zionsville, Indiana. And Zionsville is a suburb of Indianapolis, so it's a developing part of Indiana, and when they brought me on, given my background, they wanted me to, hey, let's start a school. And of course it's going to be classical education, a Lutheran classical school. So we're 3 years into that project, and it's gone really well. We're very intentional about, doing both very well, being Lutheran, but also doing classical education as well as we can. So that brings me to, so when I started at Advent Lutheran, of course, we don't have a first and second grade. We get 4 students for that first year, and we need a first and second grade teacher. So here I am. I'm your guy. So it was really that first year and second year getting reacquainted and really in a lot of ways introduced entirely to this beautiful imaginative literature, from folk tales to fairy tales to poetry, and it was just lovely. And so I really have a soft spot for this kind of literature, and it needs to be implemented in the school, and I'll go into all the reasons why. So, my wife tells me that I have a very unengaging personality, so I'll try to not make this too dry, but I am going to read from a manuscript, and at a few points I'll kind of step aside and just make a few aside comments. But here we go. Fostering the Imagination of a Child. Einstein once said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, but imagination encircles the world." Knowledge is important and certainly has its place, but lately in education there has been an overemphasis on knowledge and an overemphasis on practicality, much to the detriment of the imagination. As Lutheran classical educators, we need to be deliberate about fostering the imagination of a child. Why? Why must this be a deliberate effort on our part? Well, because the imagination is more important than knowledge. Einstein is right. Imaginative thinking leads to better thinking. And we are, after all, created to be imaginative beings. We've been made in the image of God, and imagination, of course, is a derivative of image. By being imaginative, we are being exactly who God intended us to be. So, let the imagination be fostered. But let it be fostered in what is good, true, and beautiful. For as Plato says, it can only be beautiful only insofar as it partakes of absolute beauty. Thus, let us nurture the imaginations of our children, but let's make sure we do it the right way. Because our children will be the keepers of civilization and the church after us. And as Frank Baum, author of Wizard of Oz, wrote, the imaginative child will become the imaginative man or woman most apt to create, to invent, and therefore to foster civilization. But what is the right way? How exactly do we nurture the impressionable imagination of a young child? Well, for one, it's by reading great literature. Literature that defies practicality. This kind of literature stretches the mind of a child and takes him into a place outside the realm of what is possible and plausible, and into a realm of mythical and mystery. And for a mind to be compelled to think about that kind of realm, that is a mind, indeed, that will be stretched. Reading Alice in Wonderland is a fine example of stretching of the mind. For children to be tasked with trying to imagine the strange happenings in that strange story will be challenging for them. But just like muscles that don't grow without lifting, the imagination won't stretch unless it is compelled to do so. As Luther puts it, take your students to a place where reason is offended. Let reason be offended. Let reason stagger and be dumbfounded. Let your students imagine the impossible. And to be sure, the impossible can be offensive to what is reasonable. Flying ships, flying dragons, reading about wizards and magical potions and magical forests. These are good things for young children to take in, to think about, to imagine. Because the mind naturally responds with attention to beautiful, vigorous, and imaginative writing. A child's imagination is a precious thing. Literature, like perhaps nothing else, impacts the delicate imagination of a child. What kind of literature best fosters the imagination of a child? Well, for younger students, it's fairy tales and folk tales, legends and myths, rich poetry, and short stories. These are the basic building blocks of more complex literature for later on. Read Aesop's fables to your students, especially to your first and second graders, for these fables stimulate the imagination in a vivid way. Some of you might know that Luther had a very high regard for Aesop's fables, translating them into his mother tongue, German, but also using them in his sermons. And at one point he even said that Aesop's fables, aside from the Bible, teach morality better than anything else. And there's much to learn from the fables of Aesop, beyond simply that they are good for the imagination. There's virtue to be learned. Let your students hear and learn about what it means to be truthful in The Boy Who Cried Wolf. persistence and fortitude in the tortoise and the hare. And let them imagine the crow putting pebbles in the pitcher of water so that he can drink, not to mention the wonderful scientific principles that come with that fable. Also for young children, but not exclusively for younger children, read mythologies. Greek mythology, to be sure, but Roman and Norse mythology will do as well, because these mythologies defy what is logical and excite the imagination like few things can. How is it that Atlas can hold up the sky? How is it that a horde of miseries were let loose from Pandora's box? What do those even look like? And how does that impact the rest of humanity? And how is it that Artemis can pick up water and throw it like a baseball? Let a child consider these questions and ideas. These stories challenge the realm of possible, and they must be explored if a child's imagination and overall thinking are to be stretched. But does Greek mythology really influence our thinking and imaginations? Ask Shakespeare. You would be hard-pressed to find any of his writings that don't include some mythological reference. And who of you would question Shakespeare? His imagination has led to the creation of new words, phrases, expressions, and ideas that we still hold on to today. Shakespeare's use of imagery and analogy are unparalleled, making him one of the foremost and best storytellers of all time. And for him, it all started with Greek mythology. Rich poetry and nursery rhymes are all also most influential of the imagination of a child. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon, the little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. Now this nursery rhyme, and ones like it, challenge the thinking and the imagination. This poem is entirely nonsensical, impractical, illogical, and entirely what a child needs. Because rhymes like this one, or one like winkin', blinkin', and nod, sailing off in a wooden shoe, these push the limits and compel a child to not only think of what's literal, but what is imaginary. And an imaginary mind that has been nourished in what is good, true, and beautiful imagines good, true, and beautiful things. Read a rich poem each morning after your daily matin service, but read it at the very beginning of class. No need to discuss it too intensely, especially with the younger students, but instead read it to them and just let the poem rest with them. There can be a moment of just quiet, allowing them to take it in and ask questions about it if they like. Without a doubt, not only does poetry and nursery rhymes add a sense of imagination and wonderment to the classroom, but they also add beautiful rhythm and a pleasing cadence and are just delightful to listen to and ponder. A bright imagination is not only beneficial in the trivium sort of way, but also in the quadrivium sort of way. Consider what Dr. J. Wiley, professor at Memorial College and contributor to the magazine The Classical Teacher, says. The brilliant astronomer Johannes Kepler saw an analogy for the Trinity in his theory of the universe. The sun represented God the Father. The sphere of the stars at the edge of the universe represented God the Son. And the space in between represented God the Holy Spirit. Where did Kepler get this guiding principle? It wasn't from a collection of data. It wasn't from the work of a previous scientist. It was from his imagination. Kepler imagined that God would imprint his very nature into the structure of the universe. And as a result, Kepler was able to revolutionize the way astronomers understood the heavens. If you take time to read the great scientists of the past, you will see that their imaginations were critical to their work. Archimedes imagined the surface of each body of water to be the surface of a sphere, because he knew the earth was a sphere. As a result, he was able to use geometry to derive his law of the lever and his principle of buoyancy. Blaise Pascal imagined the atmosphere as a weight that was pushing down on all things it touched. He then described an experiment to his brother-in-law that would determine whether or not he was correct. Because his brother-in-law performed the experiment, we now know that the atmosphere exerts pressure, and we also know that this is true for any fluid, which led engineers to develop the hydraulic lift. Despite the fact that it is rarely included in the scientific literature, imagination is just as important a part of the scientific process today as it was in the past. The search for knowledge is a creative endeavor. As such, it requires a rich imagination. Now you might ask, well, if the imagination is so valuable, then why is it being abandoned by some? When it comes to fostering the imagination of a child, why do we see such a distinction between our Lutheran classical schools and the public school just down the street? And is this distinction intentional, or does it just kind of happen? This is the Nathaniel Pullman part of my paper, as I like to say. In many places, I think it just kind of happens, because people don't always realize the value in the imaginary, the fanciful, the impractical. And instead, they'd rather stick to only those things that are literal, plausible, and expedient. Public schools prefer practicality. Besides, practicality is quantifiable, objectifiable, and it's harder to do that with the imagination. And so the imaginative is abandoned for the practical, the inexpedient for the expedient, the far-fetched for the easy to grasp, the enchanting for the literal. Practicality is a staple and tenet of progressive education. If it's not practical, if it's not relevant to the real world, then cast it aside, dismiss it. Imaginative literature is insufficient and incapable of developing the kind of practical and industrialized students that we're going for, because, after all, what do hobbits and dragons have to do with students making it big in the real world? Consequently, like my home state of California, local and state governments are relegating and even entirely forsaking imaginative literature. Poetry, fairy tales and folk tales, legends and mythologies, all these are out, and literature on real-life application is in. Because again, what does imaginative literature have to do with me getting that job of 6 figures? In Prince Caspian, Miraz does not want Caspian to learn about the history and fairy tales of their world. And Miraz certainly does not want Caspian to know that animals can talk. Your kings, Caspian is told, are in deadly fear of the sea because they can never quite forget that in all the stories, Aslan comes from over the sea. So, the Telmarines invent false stories and false narratives to replace the good and true stories. Because Miraz knows that an imaginative person is a dangerous person. Miraz knows that a person with no imagination, with no creative or critical thinking, well, that kind of person is easier to control. To be sure, state governments do not believe in hobbits and dragons. And they don't want the children of their jurisdiction believing in that sort of thing either. The secular world wants nothing to do with the imagination that has been nurtured in what is good, true, and beautiful. Because that kind of imagination is a threat to them. But we're not only seeing this in our schools. Just as progressive education is abandoning the imaginative for the practical, our churches are doing the same thing. In our churches, even in some of our LCMS churches, there is a focus on practicality. And if your main focus is on the pragmatic, then you are less focused on something else. You are forsaking something else. And what is it? What is being forsaken, forgotten? What is being given up? The majestic. Because after all, what purpose does the majestic and holy have when you can be more realistic and casual? The majesty and reverence are seen as meaningless and unimportant, and so these are tossed aside and replaced with what is practical and irreverent. Consequently, beautiful vestments and paraments are given up. Pastors and clericals are supplanted with pastors in skinny jeans and spiked hair. Beautiful sanctuaries are forfeited for something a bit more multi-use, multifunctional, and casual, because after all, that's more inviting. Rich hymnody and historic liturgy are brushed aside, all in the name of practicality. The fact that this is happening should not entirely surprise us. In fact, C.S. Lewis brings this out quite a bit in his rich stories. When Lucy got back from Narnia for the first time and Peter and Susan were having a difficult time believing her story, Peter and Susan went to the professor and they asked him if it was possible that there be another world outside their own, something like Narnia. And the professor responded matter-of-factly, "Nothing is more probable." And then the professor quipped, "What do they teach them at these schools?" The professor saw the deficiency in education. And this deficiency in education leads to a deficiency in life. And in the voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace is at a disadvantage compared to the others in his company because, as C.S. Lewis writes, Eustace had read all of the wrong books. He read books on pragmatic matters, but not on imaginative matters. As such, Eustace fails to see the danger of dragons, precisely because he had never read or imagined one. But the wise and witty G.K. Chesterton tells us that children must read about dragons, not so that they know that they exist, but children must read about dragons so that they know that they can be conquered. And to be sure, There aren't many better lessons for a child to learn than to know that dragons and evil is conquerable, or at the very least, must be confronted. Good, true, and beautiful literature teaches precisely that. Our children, yes, must know that evil exists. Tolkien tells us that Bilbo never would have known the sound of a wolf's howl had it not been for the stories that he read. Evil is out there. But our children must also know that evil can be defeated. Smaug was soundly defeated. The Wicked Witch of the West dissolved with water, and Shere Khan was skinned. Now, that's not to say that our children must think that all evil in this life will be snuffed out. There will always be evil on this side of glory. But the lesson that they should learn from dragons and fairy tales is that evil must be challenged, and the good never compromised. Bilbo found courage to confront the dreadful dragon. Mowgli, the fortitude to not yield to Shere Khan. May our students find the same courage and fortitude to confront evil, because there are bullies on the playground and in life, and they need to be stood up to. Indeed, children learn that dragons can and should be conquered in imaginative literature, and they also encounter some of the greatest heroes in this kind of literature. How can somebody not read Cinderella and not be impacted by her heroics in humility and in her own fortitude? How can our young ones not read Treasure Island and not sit up a little bit straighter when they see the courage and daring of young Master Hawkins? And who can forget about Orpheus, the one who dared all for love, even going down to the underworld to retrieve his wife, who was taken from him far too soon. And under the spell of his lovely music, Orpheus drew iron tears down Hades' cheek and made hell grant what love did seek. Which of our young men doesn't hear the story of Orpheus and not walk away with some sense of the self-sacrificial love that is required to be a husband? Good, true, and beautiful literature induces our students to heroics, be it heroics in humility, in courage and daring, or in sacrificial love. And one place where you will see the students' imaginative heroics play out is at recess time. I honestly don't know how long this is going to go. I think I have until 11, right? 11 o'clock, okay. Read about the Titan wars in Greek mythology, and at recess time, the students themselves have taken on the characters of Zeus and Poseidon and others, and they are throwing their bolts of lightning, sticks, as they try to conquer the Titans. Read Moby Dick, or at least the abridged version for first grade. And at recess, you might just see them throwing their harpoons, sticks, into the great white whale Moby Dick, a big mound of dirt. Read Narnia and watch them create their own game of Narnia tag, where students can be turned to stone if you're not too careful. And you must get 4 of your players on the 4 thrones of Cair Paravel to win the game. These are all true examples at my school, by the way. We also see this in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer when Tom and Joe Harper are out playing in the woods. This is a quote from the book. Just here the blast of a toy tin trumpet came faintly down the green aisles of the forest. Tom flung off his jacket and trousers, turned a suspender into a belt, raked away some brush behind the rotten log, disclosing a rude bow and arrow, a wood sword and a tin trumpet, and in a moment had seized these things and bounded away bare-legged with fluttering shirt. He presently halted under a great elm, blew an answering blast, and then began to tiptoe and look warily out, this way and that. He said cautiously to an imaginary company, "Hold, my merry men! Keep hid till I blow!" Now appeared Joe Harper. As airily clad and elaborately armed as Tom called, "Hold! Who comes here into Sherwood Forest without my pass?" "Guy of Gisborne wants no man's pass. Who art thou that dares to hold such language?" said Tom, prompting, for they talked by the book from memory. "Who art thou that dares to hold such language?" "I, indeed, I am Robin Hood, as thy despicable carcass soon shall know." "Then art thou indeed that famous outlaw? Right gladly will I dispute with thee the passes of the merry wood. Have at thee!" They took out their wooden swords, dumped their other traps on the ground, struck a fencing attitude, foot to foot, and began a grave and careful combat. And this is exactly what we want to see. Students emulating the characters of the good books that they are reading in class. Students emulating the virtues of these characters. Imaginative literature compels our students to heroics. And if they are practicing heroics at recess time, the chances of them being heroic when it matters most are far better. But for the student who doesn't read about great heroes in classics, chances are far less that he will know how to be a hero when his time comes. Truly, we need heroic men and women, heroic husbands, heroic wives, heroic educators, heroic politicians and plumbers, and it all can start with heroic literature. Now, to be clear, the imagination can be a wonderful thing, but it also can be badly trained. From Luke 1 and the Magnificat, we hear how the Lord has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. The imagination that is not formed from the good, the true, and the beautiful can be a dangerous thing. It is these types of imaginations that, as St. Paul writes in Romans, imagine and invent evil things. So if the imagination is not fostered in the right kind of way, the imagination will imagine wrongly. Besides this, there are certainly limitations to the imagination. The imagination can only take you so far. The Greeks of antiquity perhaps had the greatest minds we have ever seen, evidenced by everything from their architecture, governance, philosophical thought, and so on. We also see their great imaginative minds, of course, through the lens of their stories. Homer might be the greatest storyteller of all time. The Iliad, the greatest book of all time, after the Bible, of course. Homer created wonderful characters for our delight, from Hector with his shining helmet to the great strategist Odysseus. Homer also delights us with wonderful stories about the Greek gods. But even though Homer had one of the most vivid imaginations of all time, it was still very limited. Homer only ever imagined demigods, one that is part God and part man. He and the rest of those great minds from antiquity never imagined one who would be both full God and full man. And even though Socrates arrived at the true conclusion that all man want is to be justified, he himself was not a believer. Which brings me to my next point. We cannot be saved by what we can imagine. The imagination in itself is insufficient. We, of course, are saved by Christ alone. But there is an interplay between the imagination and faith. Fostering the imagination is not only beneficial in an academic sense, but also in a theological sense. A child who can imagine the impossible, hobbits and dragons, flying monkeys and talking animals, cyclops and other mythological creatures, has less of a difficult time believing theological truths. A triune God, water turning into wine, wine changing into blood, and so on. These aren't much of a stretch for the imaginative mind. Much like reason, faith in Christ stands alone, but reason can be helpful to faith. Since the flood covered the tops of the highest mountains, it is not mind-boggling for us at all as Christians. In fact, it's quite reasonable that fish fossils have been found at the top of Mount Everest. To us, that is very reasonable. The movement of the planets in their predictable patterns, natural law, deciduous trees, there is much reason in these things, and this can be helpful to faith. The imagination can also be helpful to faith, but once again, let me be clear, faith in Christ stands alone. But for the non-Lutheran student in your class, whose imagination has been fostered to believe the unbelievable, well, believing that baptism saves and that the Holy Communion is the true body and blood of Christ, believing these things to be true is less daunting for the imaginative mind. So for those of you who have non-Lutherans in your schools, continue to teach them as they are Lutherans. Don't ever soften our Lutheran theology, not even for the non-Lutherans. And don't underestimate the potential of an imagination that has been developed in what is good, true, and beautiful. God can use reason to help convert a person, and he can use the imagination to do the same. Our Lutheran classical schools need to fully embrace imaginative literature. Imaginative literature leads to imaginative thinking, and imaginative thinking leads to better thinking and good theological thinking. And it is this that our Lutheran classical schools must foster. Thank you. Well, I suppose we have a few minutes. If there are any quick questions, be happy to entertain those. If not, then I guess we can go to lunch early. Even those of you with kids. Yes? Yeah, if you are a school that's trying to transition to be a classical school, I think the best place to start, I'm not saying this is your case, but start with the books. Just pull in great imaginative literature. And even though a lot of schools are dismissing these books, I mean, do all you can to pump them into the curriculum. As far as mythology, I get this all the time from my parents. Why are we reading about pagan gods, right? Well, I mean, they're great stories, and it stops there. We don't put any faith, any trust in these things. They're just great imaginative stories, and they're, great for the imaginative mind. And that's it. And I have to give that disclaimer all the time to parents, and even to the kids, too, just so they don't get too carried away with these things. But I don't know if that's helpful, but push for it. Even if it's one book a semester, and then two the next semester. And I would just really emphasize the imagination and how these books are good for the imagination. Yes?
I would argue they're also good for developing the discerning mind. I read the children's version of the Odyssey and got similar flack from parents. And one of the things that I discussed is as I'm reading this, and Odysseus is being guided by, a false god. Okay, well, is this true? And helping them to start to identify truth, even though their brain isn't fully there yet, planting the seeds for later on is such an important thing. And then they are recognizing the traces of these characters throughout history. We also read the story of the world, and how much, when you're reading, with Moby Dick, which I also do, I was so excited you brought that up. But if you read Moby Dick, you read the Odyssey, these things, they come up in history, and children recognize them for what they are, and not just these random names that they have no connection to.
Right.
It's just, and it connects in ways that you can't plan for either.
Right.
And it's so beautiful when your students' eyes just light up because they're connecting these things from all these different disciplines.
Right. Yeah, and a well-trained mind will be able to recognize, what is true, what is not. Great literature isn't always about virtue, but there's a lot of vice in there too, and it's addressed as such, right? Don't do this. This is what happens when you commit adultery, whatever it might be with King Arthur. But anyways, yeah, a well-trained mind would be able to recognize that. Yes, sir.
Kindly address stimulating theological imagination during chapel and mass.
Sure. So we do daily matins at our school, and we go through, we have our own lectionary where we start, we start with Genesis and work all the way through the Bible, and we really just go with the church calendar. And I mean, there are a lot of, I say as Christians, we are called to believe the unbelievable, right? I mean, the Red Sea, indeed, it split in two, a wall on the right and a wall on the left. That's what the Bible says, and that's what we believe. Now, that can be a challenge for students, especially non-Christians, but I think that itself, as long as we, this is truth, this is what happened, and, I mean, we've got to just, I know it comes up all the time in the Bible, these stories that seem to defy reason, but to us it's very, very true, very logical. And I think for a lot of students it does stretch their imagination, but it's... So I would say it comes up there in the readings, but also in our hymnody. I don't know, John, does that help at all? Yeah.
Bring the kids around the pond, talk about the cross, dipping into the pond with the blood of Jesus, coming into it, kind of like an oil slick, pass through that.
Yeah.
We reference the birth that way as well. Likewise with Christ stepping out of heaven, through the rare use of the altar and Holy Communion, just stimulating their imagination in those kind of ways. Then the kids committing it to heart, in classroom.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think even the ceremonies that you do, if you make the sign of the cross or if you bow at certain points in the liturgy, stuff like that, those can be very helpful too. We don't do it because it earns us anything, or at least in terms of salvation, but they're good for teaching. It's good for discipline. And this can really, help kind of rein in and teach the imagination of a child as well. Yes, Megan.
We read a lot of books in our family, and we did it in my classroom as well. And I think it's incredible the way that lots of good stories lead young men and women into virtue and taking on that heroic element. How do you combat a student or a child who reads the same story and is more drawn to the villain and wants to imitate the villain in the story and thinks, oh, now I have new ways of sinning?
Yeah. So I did my vicarage at Redeemer in Fort Wayne, and part of the vicarage was learning under Pastor Peterson, but also Nathaniel Pullman. And so, you guys know Nathaniel Pullman just can be very blunt and straightforward, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. I remember one of the first times I was in the classroom watching him, and he, rebuked a kid kind of sternly. I'm like, you could do that? But I think in that case, some kid who's drawn to Shere Khan would be like, well, look, guess what? Shere Khan gets skinned. Just so they can see that, evil is conquered. And this is something that we see in the great stories, that evil, there's a reason why it is destroyed. And, I will sometimes put them in their place. It's fine to have a little fascination, I guess, but as long as they, in the end, see that Shere Khan's going down. Yes? Yeah.
Through the imagination, huge imagination they have, they start doing things that are wrong, not only for them, but for everybody. So is there any limit that we should tell kids, okay, you can imagine, but don't go far away, or how can we put some limits?
Yeah. I think let your classical curriculum be your guide. The great stories, let those guide your imagination. But you're right. There are a lot of schools that don't use great literature, and that's going to be their guide instead, and that's where it gets dangerous. So having a great curriculum in place, great teachers, and let those things guide you into what is good, true, and beautiful. And of course, always founded on Scripture. Our Lord, of course, is the source of all that is good, true, and beautiful. But let the curriculum be your guide, which is a big responsibility to making sure that it's good curriculum. It's beautiful curriculum. Sir?
I'm very glad to hear you talking about the fantastical elements that involve fighting, that involve combat, that involve imaginary struggles against monsters or enemies. So much of the failure of progressive schools is this zero tolerance for any play that might be perceived as emulating violence or anything having to do with weapons. And it's, I think, important for us to, again, through letting the curriculum be our guide, to recognize the difference between children playing with swords and harpoons that are sticks. Even all the way to lightsabers and other, fantastical play that recognize that, especially for our boys, that they want to be brave. They want to fulfill their vocation as men. They want to fulfill their vocation as protector, as leader, and this is a way for them to explore those ideas.
Yes.
And that a boy who doesn't imagine fighting turns into a man who is led, who is ruled, and not a man who is prepared to defend his family or his community.
Right. So true. Yeah, the Lord trains my hands for war, right? And we need our young men to be exposed to good and proper violence. I've got 4 boys, and I mean, after they read the books, we watched The Lord of the Rings. And I think the movies are well done, but it's very clear that there's evil and that there's good. And it's not too grotesque, it's not too gruesome. I even let my 2 oldest boys watch Braveheart not too long ago. I fast-forwarded some parts, but it's good for them to see that this is what it is to be a man. If it's not violence on the battlefield, then yes, protecting your family, your wife. There is a fight for what is good, true, and beautiful, and our young men must be equipped to do this. And yeah, great literature does that. So we should not shield our boys from this type of stuff. Yes, sir?
I would agree with that, because there is a real threat. And the drop home of Revelation is exactly what we want our boys and others to understand. There's also a very real sword, which is the sword of the Spirit, the sword of the Word. And teaching our children that there's a very real battle that they'll engage that is not imaginary, but can be rooted in imaginary things initially.
Right.
So I think where we've dropped the ball a little bit is understanding there is a real dragon.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's a real battle. And if we don't understand that we are in a battle as Christians, then we're going to have a much harder time engaging and bringing the war to the minds of our children.
Right. Well said. I agree completely. Yes, sir?
I think imagination story is a good way of teaching vocations. Alistair McIntyre, for example, said that human beings are storytelling creatures, and it's through reading stories that we come to see various roles in life. I think that before we teach vocation and catechism, it might be a good idea to have stories that kind of open up or show these vocations.
Yeah, totally. I think they go side by side. We're teaching our kids the catechism, right away in first grade. But absolutely, Orpheus, I think that's one of the greatest stories of all time. But him going down to Hades to retrieve his wife, I think she was taken from him on their wedding day. But it's self-sacrificial, it's beautiful, and it's everything that a husband needs to be. And yes, I think absolutely you can pull that out, and great literature. It's easily pulled out to, in that way where you can really talk about vocation. Yeah.
So I've seen students at the college level where their imagination has been starved by kind of the overemphasis on practicality. They kind of use this
Yeah.
type student. I've also seen, more recently, I guess, the imagination deadened by technology. The emphasis, and sometimes of things we think are imaginative because there's so much special computer graphics or something, or just by the snippet-like mentality of like too short of content, too quickly, and too much. How do you, as a headmaster, work with families, since a lot of that is something that will happen outside of school?
Yeah. So we are a very low to no tech school. Occasionally, like in science class, if they're not quite getting it, they're not quite seeing it, and their imagination needs a little bit of stimulation, then I might pull up a 2-minute video on YouTube. But that's maybe once a month, and that's about the extent of our technology. We're 1st through 8th grade, we're a no-phone school, and it really comes down to culture. This is who we are. We're low tech to no tech. We don't allow kids to bring phones into the school. And I think if you are that, then you will attract those kind of families. And I think it just kind of goes with culture. And we talk about it as much as we can. I think it's something that we can do a better job about. But I even like putting on lectures at school once a semester about why you need to keep your kids away from their phones until they're 25, whatever it might be. But yeah, I think as much as we can, we need to push this because it's very real and it's going to get even harder as we move ahead. But I do think that classical Lutheran education, we've got a fine niche. As society goes this way, we're standing our ground right here, and you are going to attract the kind of families that want to be, a part of this wonderful culture that fosters the imagination, that is, tech. It has its purposes in some ways, but not for the 12-year-old. So just be that in your culture, and you will attract the right families. I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah. Sure, go for it.
So in our school, we have a couple non-Lutheran families. So, and some of these students, and we know that they have a lot of technology at home, and they're struggling with reading and writing and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But now, after a series of years and reading them fairy tales, having them narrate them back orally, things like that, I'm realizing that these students are actually changing. I think, for me, the theory is that they were lacking the ability to visualize because they always had TVs in front of them, so they could not actually see these stories in their head. And now, after all of these very imaginative tales, they've gotten used to visualizing it and describing it, and now after that, I can teach them other things. And
Love it. Very nice. Okay. Well, I'll be around if you guys want to talk anymore, but thank you very much.